Hey everybody, my name is Rose Pagachnik. I am your instructor for the course, and I want to incorporate some lectures to help clarify some of the main concepts for the week. And so this week we're going to be talking about sentencing and goals. And as I noted in my announcement on Monday, the information in this particular section refers to the performance objectives 1, 2, and 3 that are located in your syllabus. So I'm going to be spending some time talking about some of the goals of sentencing, some of the types of sentencing, sentencing models, and then lastly I'm going to close and dig a little bit deeper and talk about some of the issues that we have in sentencing. And so before we can do that, we really need to look at what is our goal. Essentially, when we sentence someone, what are we really trying to accomplish? And the bottom line is, no matter what our goal is, we are really trying to promote social order, because what it really boils down to, and you really think about it, we have this entire criminal justice system. So we have law enforcement, and they work so hard to, to prevent crime and make arrests, and then that arrest gets then moved into the court system. The court system is very structured in determining whether someone is guilty or not guilty. For those that are found guilty, we then move into this correctional phase, or this correctional component, of the justice system. And so why do we have that? And really what it boils down to is, why have laws? Why have a court system to find guilt if we don't have any way to enforce those laws? And so really that's what the correctional system is trying to do. It's really promoting social order, because why have laws that regulate behavior if we don't have any way to punishment? Yes, we would like to think that everyone is just going to follow the laws because it's the right thing to do. Of course, we know that's not feasible. We wouldn't need the system if that's the way it was. So really, when we are really trying to figure out why do we have sentencing, it's really to promote social order. Now, moving on, talking about the goals of sentencing. Of course, these were introduced last week, and we continue this discussion this week. I'm going to talk about them as being 6 different goals. Here's the catch. Between the literally multiple textbooks we have on corrections, as an intro to corrections, there are multiple textbooks, plus not to mention all the journal articles that's ever been written about the goals of sentencing. And depending on the source is going to be determine how many goals of sentencing they say there are. I've seen anywhere up to 10 goals of sentencing to as little as 5. I like to present this as having 6 goals of sentencing. I do combine a couple of them, and then I do separate a couple of them out. So the first goal of sentencing is retribution. And retribution is most commonly known as revenge. It used to be personal vengeance before we had a formal correctional or criminal justice system where people were allowed to get personal vengeance on someone. Retribution is basically about getting even. Lex talionis is an age-old term that we have that talks about an eye for an eye. So retribution is really about payback and getting even. Just desserts is very similar to retribution, and that's why some authors will combine that and just have retribution. Now, please note, I'm a little bit of a grammar in English. I don't even know what to call them. I really like to talk about the English language and really like to use it appropriately. Not to mention, communication is one of the key skills that's necessary in our field, both written as well as oral communication. And so notice I said just desserts. So what I always tell students as a little way to remember that, it sounds like cake. So I'm saying it desserts, which normally would have 2 S's, but it's spelt like the Sahara Desert. So it's just desserts. Yes, I'm both saying it correctly and have it spelt correctly. It's a Latin term, which is why there is a difference. Now, ultimately, no matter that aside, just desserts is really looking at what we call moral culpability. Now, culpability is a term that we use in the system to talk about blameworthiness. And so just desserts is really talking about the immoral aspect of crime, being, moral behavior is one that follows the rules. Immoral is obviously not acting how is expected of you. And so just desserts is really the goal of sentencing that says someone deserves to be punished, to really kind of balance. When you commit crime, it unbalances our moral behavior. Just desserts is that they deserve it, to bring that back into balance. And again, a lot of authors will combine that with retribution. All right, the third goal of sentencing is deterrence. Now, some authors will separate specific deterrence and general deterrence as two different goals. And that does make sense, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But deterrence is just trying to prevent something. And so deterrence as a goal of sentencing is really trying to prevent future crime. And we can do that in one of two ways. And again, this is why some will separate these two goals out, because they really have very differing goals and that they're for a different audience. So specific deterrence is for that specific offender. So for example, we sentence Johnny to 180 days in jail because we don't want Johnny to drive drunk again. And so specific deterrence is to try to prevent that specific offender from doing this crime again. So we sentence Johnny, again, to 180 days in jail so he doesn't drive drunk again. That's specific deterrence. General deterrence is to prevent crime on a larger scale or to the general public. And so ultimately, general deterrence is to send the message that crime doesn't pay. So we sentenced Johnny to 180 days in jail for drunk driving to send the message to the general public that crime doesn't pay. We want the general public to look at Johnny and say, I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want to spend 180 days in jail. And so I'm not going to do that. So general deterrence is to try to prevent the general public by making examples of offenders, and that is specific deterrence. So specific deterrence is to prevent someone from recidivating or repeating crime. General deterrence tries to send that message through the use of specific deterrence. Now we also have, ultimately, these are based in a concept known as hedonism. Now last week you were introduced to Jeremy Bentham. He was actually a philosopher that had some really unique ideas on crime and how we can punish or how we can achieve crime prevention. Now, hedonism is this basic human instinct that we all try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. That's known as hedonism. Hedonistic calculus is basically an equation, so yes, it's math, and basically he had this huge table of formulas for how we can deter specific crimes. So basically, he had, essentially for the crime of theft, so to make the pleasure of whatever goods you gain by committing theft, we want to make the pain of incarceration more than that. And that, according to hedonism and the hedonistic calculus, would deter criminals. And so considering, it was a couple hundred years ago, it was really innovative, and we actually see some of those concepts being carried through today with some of our sentencing models. But the hedonistic calculus was equations to try to minimize the pleasure by maximizing the pain, or taking away the pleasure by ensuring the pain of whatever punishment would ensue. Now, with deterrence, it is one of the many that we have a lot of ethical considerations. Now, the primary ethical consideration is deterrence is, how do we know enough is enough? So, for example, back to my example of Johnny. We gave Johnny 180 days in jail to try to send the message for general deterrence to the general population that crime doesn't pay. Now, what if Johnny, the first day in jail, Johnny learned his lesson? He said, you know what? This is terrible. I will never, ever, ever drive drunk again in my life. Now, the ethical consideration is, when is enough enough? So basically, Johnny's going to spend 179 days more in jail to achieve the goal of general deterrence. Now, that might come at some pretty significant cost to Johnny. He may lose his job, those types of, of consequences that he was already deterred. And so those are some of the considerations. And some we know 180 days isn't enough. And so, and we never will know, because we have this thing called individual free will, and people learn at different speeds. And so those are some of the things we need to consider when talking about both specific and general deterrence. Now, incapacitation as a goal, a lot of times people will call, instead of incapacitation, we'll say incarceration. And now that's accurate to some extent. Incapacitation is basically when we remove someone or their ability to commit crime, in that we remove them from society for a time period so they can't commit crime. That's incapacitated. Or we incapacitate them in some way. And the most common way to achieve incapacitation is through incarceration, whether it be jail or prison. But please keep in mind, we can also achieve incapacitation through other means, being under house arrest, being on electronic monitoring, or those types of things essentially achieve the goal of incapacitation. And no matter how we are incapacitating someone, it's really all based on what we call expected punishment, where, again, we need to make sure that it's very clear, and this ties in with that goal of deterrence, that it's clear on, you're going to be incapacitated for this amount of time to achieve this goal of sentencing. All right, rehabilitation as a goal is really also a lot of times called reformation, in that we want to change your lifestyle. And most often it is through some type of treatment. Now, treatment can be anything from chemical dependency to anger management to sexual offender tendencies. So treatment can be in many, many different shapes. But we also know that achieving educational goals can facilitate rehabilitation. We know that, once someone who or achieves a high school diploma, their recidivism rate goes down. We know education is directly related to recidivism rates. And so some might call rehabilitation, or an educational program, rehabilitation. We also job training, different skills, trades, those types of things. One of my favorite quotes was actually through a priest, Father Doyle, said, "Nothing stops a bullet like a job." And we know that that's a great way to reduce recidivism and achieve rehabilitation. And that really, rehabilitation is, in its most basic form, is changing your lifestyle. And so that's one of the ways we can achieve that goal. Now, the goal of restoration is actually receiving a lot of attention. It is the same as restorative justice, which the system is incorporating at all levels at this point. It's one of the buzzwords and something that we'll be talking about throughout the quarter. Basically, for the longest time, we focused on the offender and dealing with the offender. And ultimately, what restoration or restorative justice really does is it first gives the victim a voice. It used to be that the victim was just a witness. We would bring in the victim to the court system, and they were a witness. What restorative justice really does is it focuses on accountability. Yes, in restorative justice, the offender still can go to jail or prison, but it also incorporates this idea that the offender needs to be accountable to not only themselves, but to the victim as well as the community at large. We know crime hurts everyone in the community. For example, I have never been personally victimized. Yet I won't walk alone at night because I know it can happen. Because so crime affects everyone, every member of the community. And I don't have, obviously I worked in the system for many years, and so I know firsthand. Yet as a member of the community, it's no secret that it may not be the safest thing to do walking alone at night. So restoration is the obligation of the offender to really repair the harm done to all, to both the victim and the community. And again, this is a concept that we're going to be talking about throughout the quarter. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about some different types of sentences. First, when we look at mandatory sentence, ultimately, these are written right into statute. The judge doesn't have any discretion. It is crimes where it says if this is your crime, this is how much time you are going to serve, and that's the sentence. There's no discretion whatsoever. That's why it's called mandatory. Now, some are going to argue whether or not that's appropriate. We know that we are not a one-size-fits-all system, and sometimes the offender's motivation may need to be taken into consideration. But the challenge to that is whenever we take into individual circumstances into consideration, we open the door for bias, which creates obviously even more problems. But another example of this is as to whether it not be appropriate. Let's say someone has robbed a convenience store. And let's say their motivation was to get cash for drugs, or their motivation was cash to buy the prescription that their dying mother needs. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example, but those are some of the things when people are arguing whether or not mandatory sentences are appropriate. Those are some of the things that we're going to take into consideration. We also know that sentencing can be consecutive or concurrent. Consecutive sentencing is serving one sentence after another. Very rarely will someone come to jail or prison with just one charge. Jail maybe, prison rarely. Most time, if someone's going to prison, they were being convicted of multiple charges. So it might have been an assault and robbery. Now, consecutive sentencing, obviously they're going to get a sentence for the assault. Let's say they got 26 months for the assault and 14 months for the robbery. If they're going to serve those consecutively, they're going to serve the 26 months and then the 14 months for a total of 40 months. That's a consecutive sentence, one after the other. Concurrent is when they are going to run those two sentences at the same time. So ultimately, rather than serving the total of 40 months in the consecutive sentencing, the offender is going to serve a total of 26 months because the 14-month sentence is going to be running at the same time. Most jurisdictions are defaulting right now to concurrent sentencing simply because of overcrowding. Overcrowding, not only do we not have the space, we don't have the cells available, we can't afford to either build new cells or hold individuals for a longer time. So the default right now is concurrent sentencing. A judge does have the option to go consecutive sentencing if there's something particular heinous about the crime. The judge can do or can recommend a consecutive sentence. But for the most part, we are defaulting to the concurrent sentence. All right, the two most common that we see as far as sentencing models, and really what this is trying to figure out, do we sentence the crime or do we sentence the criminal? And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. Indeterminate sentencing is when someone or a state will have a minimum and a maximum. And it is up to the offender and the offender's behavior to determine when they get out. And so let's say, for that 26-month sentence, in an indeterminate state, the judge might say you can serve as little as 14 months with a maximum of 26 months. That's indeterminate sentencing. And then the judge is going to set up several goals. And so, for instance, one of the goals might be successfully complete a chemical dependency program, successfully get your GED or high school diploma, depending on their age. Complete after you've completed your GED, successfully complete one of the trades training that the prison might offer. And so indeterminate sentencing offers an incentive for the offender to better themselves. It gives them a carrot, for lack of better terms, to really try hard. It also focuses on their behavior in the institution. If you have bad behavior, if you're violating rules, getting sent to lockdown or even solitary confinement, that is going to play into when or how long you serve. So indeterminate sentencing is when we set a minimum and maximum, and it's really up to the offender to determine when they get out. If they choose to do nothing, then it's going to be 26 months. If they meet all the goals that have been set for them, it could be as little as 14 months. Now, determinate sentencing, you know your release date when you enter the facility. And so it doesn't matter what you do while you're in that facility, with the exception of some states might allow good time, some states might be able to take some time away for behavior. But determinate sentencing, in theory, is you know that how long you're going to serve, regardless of what you do to improve yourself. And this is basically determinate sentencing is really punishing the crime. It's not looking at the individual offender or the criminal. It's looking at the crime, and basically it's saying for this crime, here's the sentencing that we give. No questions asked. Where indeterminate sentencing is really punishing the criminal. It's looking at that individual person and figuring out what are some goals, how can we help this person help themselves, and what incentives can we give them to achieve those goals while they're in our custody. And so really we're talking about, is our big goal, the big picture, are we really trying to sentence the crime or the criminal? And this is a philosophical question that we could spend hours, and there is so much debate as far as what is best, but ultimately those are our two options for sentencing. Now, a compromise or a blend of those two sentencing models is what we refer to as guideline sentencing. Now, there are a lot of benefits with indeterminate sentencing where we set that minimum and maximum. Yet one of the things that we have seen through research and why some states have moved to determinate sentencing is whenever we allow flexibility, whenever we allow justice to be individualized and try to meet the needs of individual offenders, we also open the door for bias, or what the system refers to as disparity. Now, DMC refers to disproportionate minority confinement. Now, this is not just in corrections. We see bias and racial bias at every aspect or every element of the criminal justice system. As it relates to this topic, DMC is disproportionate minority confinement. We see racial minorities receiving longer sentences than other or their white counterparts. So disproportionate minority confinement is something at the forefront. The Department of Corrections has decided is the most immediate issue that we need to deal with. And so one of the things, or one of the ways we've done that is through guideline sentences. Now, basically what this allows us to do is it also incorporates what we know as mitigating and aggravating factors. Now, these are concepts we talked about in Intro to Criminal Justice. A mitigating factor might reduce someone's culpability or their blameworthiness. For instance, checking themselves into treatment might be a mitigating factor. It might reduce the sentence. Aggravating factors are things that are going to make something or the sentence higher, or for whatever reason it makes it worse in the judge's eyes, and so they might give a higher sentence. Basically, sentencing guidelines tries to incorporate that, yet tries to incorporate individuality as well. And basically, in states that have sentencing guidelines, it's really incorporating two different things. It's looking at the criminal history as well as the offense. Now, I'm actually going to show you, so I live in Minnesota, in beautiful St. Cloud, Minnesota. And in Minnesota, we have probably some of the most well-developed sentencing guidelines in any state. Actually, Minnesota is considered one of the leaders. So what you are seeing on your screen right now is the most recent sentencing guidelines. And ultimately, how you would read this, so let me get my pointer on here. So basically across the top here is the criminal history score. Now this is not the number of offenses. The criminal history score is actually very, very complicated math. And it's basically the score, and it's dealing with prior offenses, but there are things like what level, was it a felony, was it a misdemeanor, how long ago was it? So those are things that are taken into consideration in determining criminal history score. And then it takes into consideration the current charge. And basically, this is a table, and so you would read it as a table. So let's say that someone was convicted, their current crime is, let's see, uh, felony DWI. That's getting a lot of attention right now, where Minnesota is one of the only states that allows DWI to be charged with as a felony. It does require having several prior DWI convictions is one of the ways. So let's say it's a felony DWI. And this person is no stranger to the criminal justice system, and so they have a criminal history score of 4. So basically, you bring these two together, and this is the guideline sentence. And so the guideline, the middle of the road, is 60 months. Then you see that below that, it says anywhere between 51 and 72 months would be acceptable. So the judge can sentence that person anywhere between 51 and 72 months. And again, that's going to be based on mitigating or aggravating factors. So, for example, again, let's say this particular defendant checked himself into treatment. That might sit well with the judge, and so the judge might do the 51 months. Or let's say, for instance, in this particular case, the person was not only driving drunk to get that felony DWI charge, they also had a child in the car with them. The judge might then go up to 72 months. So basically what this allows us to do is allow the judge to have some flexibility, yet in a pretty tight range to make sure they're not showing any bias in there, or reducing or limiting the amount of bias that they can have in that sentencing. Now, the Blakely versus Washington, we know that a judge can decide to do what's known as an upward departure and not follow the guidelines. That actually went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's known as the Blakely decision. And so if a judge is going to not follow the sentencing guidelines, he or she needs to make sure that the reasoning that they are going to not follow the guidelines is or was proven beyond a reasonable doubt in the trial. So let's say, for instance, the example that I gave you, he not only is a felony level DWI, there was an infant in the car, and the judge went, you know what, this is the 3rd time you've done that. Felony DWI is the highest we can charge you with, so I want to charge you with, or I'm going to sentence you to 100 months. So higher than the highest of 72 months. Blakely would come back and take a look at that and look at the court trial. And basically, if it hadn't been established or proven beyond a reasonable doubt that a baby was in the car, the judge would not be able to use that as reasoning for an upward departure. And so when you get out into the field, you hear a lot of reference to the Blakely decision. It's kind of one of those buzzwords that we have right now, and that's what it's referring to. Sentencing guidelines does allow us to punish both the crime and the criminal. It's really a blend. Some states are using what's known as mandatory minimums. This is very similar to a mandatory sentence, where basically it's saying that, okay, here's the minimum time you're going to serve, and that's going to be written right into legislation. However, you could have an extension if you don't do anything to try to better yourselves, or you're what are known as habitual offender statutes. Now, the Minnesota guidelines does take habitual offenders into consideration. Again, it has that criminal history score, and so the higher the score is, the more you've committed crimes, the higher sentence you're going to serve. We're probably on the lower end in Minnesota as far as habitual offender statutes and how we take a look at prior criminality. Habitual offender statutes also incorporate three-strike laws. We know the state of California has probably the most strict example of three-strike laws, where literally three strikes and you're out. That third strike doesn't even have to be a felony, and everything in between. One of the things we know about three-strike laws or habitual offender statutes, they cost a lot of money. The state of California is almost broke and continues to be almost broke because they spend so much money on incarceration. And so when you're trying to decide whether or not these are a good thing, that's the one thing you need to take into consideration. California still has a very high crime rate. Plus, they spend more on incarceration than they do on education. And so, love them, hate them, doesn't matter. Those are just some of the things that you need to really take into consideration. All right, so I've already talked about a couple of the issues in sentencing, trying to be fair. We want to be proportionate. Best case scenario is that we punish both the crime and the criminal. We want to be proportionate. We want to have equity in paying social debt, yet how much is enough are some of those things that we need to take into consideration. Now, the federal government has stepped in and passed what is known as a truth in sentencing. And basically, this is the federal government's attempt at getting tough at crime, where ultimately the federal government has stepped in and told the states that anyone convicted of a felony needs to serve at least 85% of their sentence if you want to receive federal funding. Now, ultimately, receiving federal funding is not optional. States simply could not function in their correctional system without the help of the federal government. We receive a ton of funding from the federal government to offset some of the costs of corrections. So truth in sentencing was basically the federal government kind of putting their foot down, kind of exercising their authority, for lack of better terms, to try to see individuals serving longer sentences. All right, so that wraps up the information from this chapter. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. Reach out, email me, call me, come to my live office hours on Monday morning, and I am here to help. One other quick reminder, please make sure you are reviewing the announcements. Go back to the beginning of the quarter if you have to, especially on Monday. Every Monday, I post an announcement that clarifies what I want to see in all of the assignments and how I'm going to be grading them. I provide a lot of additional detail to try to help you. The way the class is set up, what's under the Lessons tab is the shell. It's the basics. I use the announcements to really clarify what my expectations are. So please, every time you log on, make sure you're checking the announcements.